I'm Marcia Torben, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of this Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series and the Santa Fe Jewish Film Festival to our webinar on Jewish humor with Professor Avinoam Patt. Today is the second session, and the subject is Jewish humor in America, from the Borscht Belt to Broad Street. I'm going to go over just a few technical items with you. The talk will last about 45 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes for a Q&A. If you have questions, if you would use the Q&A feature, there's an icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And if you would put your questions in there, make them succinct and direct so that we can answer as many questions as possible. You also, if you didn't, for some reason, if you didn't receive an email that had a link to additional resources for this class, if you could just let us know. You can do it through the Q&A, but it might be better. There's also a chat function, and if you just send a chat note to the panelists, then we can make sure that that you do get that link. It's a link to resources that include some wonderful reading material, video clips, some films that relate to the class. And I think that that is all in terms of the technical part. And I'll turn it over to Ron Duncan Hart, who will make some introductions and continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcia. And I would like to introduce Professor Avinoam Patt. Those of you who were on the webinar last week know most of this information, but some of you are new. He's the Doris and Simon Konovar Chair of Judaic Studies and Director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life at the University of Connecticut. His PhD is from New York University in Hebrew and Judaic Studies, and he studied as an undergraduate at Emory University with Professor Deborah Lipstadt, whom many of you will have heard here in Santa Fe last year and know her work. He's had a number of very important appointments, ranging from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum to being director of the Museum of Jewish Civilization, University of Hartford. As we mentioned last week, he's published widely on the post Holocaust period in Europe, on American Jewish literature, and more recently has done a book on laughter after, dealing with humor, particularly after the Holocaust. So the focus here will be on Jewish humor, and we got a very interesting start last week, from the Helm to Sholem Aleichem, and so this week we're looking forward to hearing about Jewish comedy in America, which will be much closer to the experience of many of us. So Avinoam, Professor Avinoam Patt, it's a pleasure. Thank you for being here.
Okay, great. Thank you for that introduction, Ron and Marcia. And it's a pleasure for me to be here and to see everyone who is joining the class today. I thought it was just going to be my family members, but I do not have this many family members all over the world. So it's a pleasure to see everybody joining here, and I'm happy to engage with this topic. I want to thank all of the local sponsors in Santa Fe who are making this program possible, including Ron and Marcia and the Institute for Tolerance Studies, and especially, of course, my parents, Nurit and Yehuda Patt, who are residents of Santa Fe, New Mexico. Hello, Mom and Dad. And I do have a few family members on here, which makes this very special. So I'm based in West Hartford, Connecticut, and I know my sister, Susie, who is in Jerusalem, is also joining the class. So this makes this pretty cool to be able to teach a international class in multiple time zones. So today's class, in a moment, I'm going to be sharing my screen so you can see the PowerPoint. And we're going to do kind of a whirlwind tour of American Jewish comedy or Jewish humor in America, basically from the beginning of the 20th century until the present. And what that means is that there are going to be a lot of things that I'm going to leave out. So I have to apologize. And I know that at the end, there will be Q&A questions that will say, but you didn't mention Mickey Katz, or you didn't mention, Joan Rivers, who I actually will mention, various people. So right off the bat, I will try to do my best to cover as many different people as possible, but I know that I will leave some people out. And the other thing is, thank you, Ron, for mentioning the new book, Laughter After Humor and the Holocaust. So for those of you who are receiving the information about the class, you'll know that we're doing a series in 4 parts. This week is Jewish Humor in America. Next week, we're going to be spending some time looking at Jewish humor as a response to anti-Semitism, which last week when we talked about sort of the various theories of where Jewish humor comes from, one of the prominent explanations, not the only explanation, but one of the prominent explanations is that Jewish humor emerges as a response to persecution. And next week we'll talk specifically about the types and the function of Jewish humor that emerges as a response to anti-Semitism. And very specifically, I'll be talking about some examples that relate to Jewish humor as a response to the Holocaust and the boundaries of that. So let me share my screen so folks can see the comedians and humorists that we're going to be talking about today. Okay, so you should be able to see my screen, and I'm going to put it in slideshow mode. Here we go. Okay, fantastic. So this is where I started the discussion last week with this cover slide, and it shouldn't surprise you that most of the comedians and humorists that we see on this cover slide are ones that we're going to be talking about today, ones who represent Jewish humor in America very specifically. Almost all of the ones, with the exception, I think, here of Shalom Aleichem, are Jewish comedians and Jewish humorists who are American, Jewish Americans, and very prominently known in American culture for introducing comedy and sort of paving the way for the advances of comedy as an art form in the American sphere. And one of the things that we'll look at today is the disproportionately large role that Jews play, both Jewish immigrants at the beginning of the 20th century and then the descendants of those immigrants over generations in the field of humor and comedy in America. And as you'll recall from last week, we talked about humor being an important mechanism that Jews could use both as a way to break into a new society, that is a way to kind of serve as an icebreaker where they introduce themselves to a new society, a new culture, a way of saying that I am like you, I am not so different, I am not threatening. Humor sort of diminishes the threatening aspect of a new group in a society. But, and this is one of the very important functions of Jewish humor, is that Jews as a minority group are able to use the, let's call it the insider-outsider status or outsider-insider status as a way to both participate within a society, but also observe and comment on the things that they find interesting or curious or different. And we're going to see this play itself out over the course of the 20th century, the 21st century, as Jews both serve as very important observers of American society and American culture, but also use humor in a very important way as a mechanism of kind of reflecting on that society and that culture. Now, as I've said, I'm going to race through a lot of examples today. I want to share some material with you, some I'll just refer to, and we can go back to it in the Q&A section as well. So just by way of context, one thing that I think is important to note, as we talked about at the end of class last week, is that between 1881, where we begin to see the sort of mass migration of East European Jews to America, and 1920, you can see, based on the statistics in front of you, this huge upsurge in the number of Jews coming into the United States, where you see an increase from 250,000 Jews in the United States in 1881, a small proportion of the total population. Over the course of those 40 years or so, you have somewhere between 2 and 2.5 million Jews making their way primarily from Eastern Europe, although not only from Eastern Europe, to the United States. And it's this wave of great migration. And one of the things that we see, as we talked about last week, and what I wanted us to trace through into this week, is how do these Jews who bring a sort of very distinctive East European Jewish culture with them, in many cases a sort of an attuned humoristic sense of both self-observation, a self-deprecating humor that serves them well in terms of their interactions with the surrounding world, a self-deprecating humor that serves them well in terms of response to persecution. How do they use this finely honed humor reflex, let's call it, to engage with and enter into American society? And it's a very important mechanism that Jews use in their entry to American society, both as immigrants, but also in a way that is distinctively Jewish, and is very much connected to New York, which is the place where most of, something like 3/4 of the Jews who make their way into America pass through New York City. Something like 75% of the Jews pass through New York City. This is why New York kind of becomes, by the beginning of the 20th century, the largest Jewish city in the world. You have something like 500,000 Jews living below Houston Street by about 1910 or so. And so that's just a huge number. There's no other urban area in the world that has that many Jews living in it. And so you can imagine, and these are Jews who've come from all over different parts of Europe, in particular Eastern Europe, and you have this kind of merging of this vibrant culture that is very much a Yiddish culture that these Jewish immigrants bring with them. And of course, part of that tool of sort of dealing with the hardships of immigration and becoming part of that culture is a theater, a humor that is employed as part of that process of assimilating and integrating into this new American society. Contrary to popular opinion, it is not that they are greeted by Yiddish-speaking Native Americans. Here you can see played by Mel Brooks from Blazing Saddles. Although maybe when we get to the discussion point, we can talk about sort of what this might reflect, a Yiddish-speaking Native American played by Mel Brooks, right? Like what he's trying to do here. But I'll leave that aside for now. So just a little bit about what I will plan to do over today's class. You can see that I have sort of broken down the period of the Jewish humor in America, or Jewish comedy in America, into 7 different component phases. And we're going to try to get through these different phases in class today. The first phase is the one that I just started talking about, which is the phase in which we have Yiddish culture and Yiddish folklore making its way in particular into New York, but also in other parts of the United States as well. It's not just New York. And we can see sort of this humorous tradition, cultural tradition making its way, for example, in Yiddish theater on the Lower East Side, where you have people living in really poor conditions in New York and tenement houses, really struggling, and they're looking, you know, to have some outlet for entertainment. What's important is that because you have this primarily large Yiddish-speaking population in New York, most of this entertainment, of course, is taking place in Yiddish. Around the turn of the century, and this takes us to phase 2, we also begin to see a new form of popular entertainment taking place in urban areas. Here you can see represented by vaudeville acts in particular. And these are acts that are very much sort of variety shows that might include some singing, some dancing, some performance, and what we can see as the beginnings of what we would call today sketch comedy, right? Slapstick routines that are done for laughs that are going to be very important in the development of early film comedy, like you can see the examples that we'll talk about from the Marx Brothers or the Three Stooges, that emerged from these vaudeville routines. Vaudeville comes from the French voix de ville, the voice of the city, vaudeville. And it is very much kind of an urban art form that begins to develop around this time. Complementary to this development is also a very important sort of technological innovation that begins to develop around the turn of the 20th century. And this is the idea of moving pictures or motion pictures. And so you can see also in New York around the turn of the century, these Nickelodeons where people can go for a small fee, put a coin into the machine and see moving pictures, right? And the immigrants who come at this time are, of course, looking for new ways, new industries to get involved in. And we can see sort of the beginnings of the motion picture industry taking in immigrant groups, in particular Jews, who come to play a disproportionately large role in the birth of cinema in America as well. So it's not coincidental at all that you have early film comedies and early cinema populated by immigrant groups as well. Neil Gabler writes about this in An Empire of Their Own. Things like the Warner Brothers is a perfect example of Jews who then go west to Hollywood and really develop the film industry. The fourth phase, which we'll talk about today, is kind of the second generation children of the immigrants who in the beginning in the 30s, but 40s and 50s, what we talk about is the Borscht Belt comedy, looking for places to vacation out of the heat of the city in particular, and end up in these resorts in the Catskill Mountains. So we'll talk about sort of the comedians who really get their start in the Catskills, which they then transition, and this is a very important transition, take these comedy skills to newly developing industries in radio and television, which are looking for forms of entertainment that you see Jewish writers, Jewish comedians, again, playing a disproportionately large role in television, radio, and then television in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. The next phase we'll talk about is the stand-up comedians of the 60s and 70s. Lenny Bruce, Woody Allen, and also, and this is important, you also see African Americans who are another sort of prominent minority group in American society who play a disproportionately large role as the other, the outsider, commenting on American culture through stand-up comedy. And then we'll end with reflections on changes of how Jews have been represented on television from the 1980s until today. Okay, so that's kind of the 7 phases of what we're going to talk about today, and hopefully I will get to almost all of this. All right, so let's get into it. So as I said, on the Lower East Side, we can see sort of this burgeoning Yiddish-speaking melting pot of Jews, and we see these cultural productions that begin to emerge from the Lower East Side in New York in particular. I'll skip the jokes for now. I'll come back if we have time to some of the jokes. One of the things that, and I show here Abe Kahan from the Vorwärts, the main Yiddish daily, circulation of about 250,000 copies a day, right? So it's one of the largest newspapers in America. One of the concerns that somebody like Abe Kahan, who is the editor of the Vorwärts, has is helping these Yiddish-speaking immigrants navigate the process of becoming American while also not losing their Jewish roots, right? Not completely assimilating, but sort of educating them as to how one can do this properly, remaining true to their distinctive identity, remaining true to a Jewish identity that might be a secularizing, modernizing Jewish identity, but that one that does not forget their roots entirely. And one of the things that's interesting that we can see in this period of the Yiddish-speaking immigrants who are trying to navigate this process is that we begin to see as Jews spread across the United States, and I love this Yiddish map of America, You can see on the bottom right, it's a map of the Vereinigte Staaten, right? The map of the United States. And so you can even see this is from later in the 20th century. We have all the states represented here with their Yiddish names. So next to Texas, you can see, of course, New Mexico, right? So very important for Santa Fe as well. But for these sort of first generation of Jewish immigrants who are trying to navigate this process of both coming from a Yiddish-speaking milieu, but also entertaining the Yiddish masses, we see a lot of comedians and comic performers emerging from this period in time. And the truth is that if we think about that, a lot of good comedy and humor emerges from tension, right? From this sort of navigating tensions that one experiences in life, then it shouldn't surprise us that we will see this sort of process of the tension between tradition and modernity, the tension between the old world and the new world, the pressures that amount from this tension sort of burst forth in kind of a production of a comedy that tries to negotiate a lot of this tension. You know, just to show you certain examples of this, you can see people like Eddie Cantor, right? Who is born Edward Israel Iskowitz, right? Child of Russian Jewish immigrants, who becomes very well known as both a performer who performs, of course, in English, or Al Jolson, born Asa Yoelson in Lithuania, who also comes at this period in time, and also becomes known as a Jewish performer, a Jewish singer. The Jazz Singer is an important film in American film history because it's the first talkie. But of course, in a film like The Jazz Singer, where you can see, you know, sort of him doing the singing and dancing for a popular audience, what is he dealing with? He's dealing with the tension of how does one remain true to one's traditions while becoming part of the modern world as well. The Jazz Singer is all about a kid whose father is a cantor who wants him to sing on Yom Kippur services, and all he wants to be is a jazz singer. And from this tension, we can see this navigation of, you know, sort of becoming American through music and through comedy as well. Henny Youngman is another great example of this. But one of the things that we can see with someone like Henny Youngman, who also, you know, immigrates as a young man to New York as well, is we can see one of the distinctive features of Jewish humor, which we talked about last week, which is very often the sort of very intellectual, quick-witted nature that is engaged in wordplay in many cases. So Henny Youngman becomes known as king of the one-liners, right? When I read about the evils of drinking, I gave up reading. The secret of happy marriage remains a secret. I told the doctor I broke my leg in 2 places. He told me to quit going to those places, right? You can see all of these examples of sort of wordplay that we see somebody like Henny Youngman playing on the words, but also, and this is interesting, right? This is something that immigrants are able to do as they are multilingual and learning a new sort of language with the benefit of knowing other languages. They can notice the funny aspect of those languages, right? And this, I think, lends itself to increased wordplay on the part of immigrants as well. Of course, Nathan Birnbaum is another example, someone who becomes much better known as George Burns. And one of the things that we see George Burns playing upon with his sidekick Gracie Allen is this sort of tension of both a Jewish immigrant trying to remain Jewish, but also going together with somebody who's very American, right? Or perceived to be very American. This tension, which we'll see reflected in all sorts of intermarriages or reflections on intermarriage between Jews and non-Jews, and usually between Jewish men and non-Jewish women, becomes a very prominent motif in American Jewish comedy, where they're navigating this process of becoming American. Jack Benny, Benjamin Kubelski, another famous example of this, pioneer of the Jack Benny program, who I should mention, we talked about the idea of self-deprecating Jewish humor is often critiqued for this question of, is he too self-deprecating, right? Does he play up anti-Semitic motifs too much in his comedy and in his humor? So let me just see, sorry, closing my chat. Sophie Tucker is another example of this. This is for my Hartford folks who will recognize Sophie Tucker, who's born Sophie Kalish and comes to Hartford at the age of 3 months and becomes very well known as a singer, a performer in vaudeville and the Yiddish theater, the my Yiddish mama, but crosses over. Or Fanny Bryce. And one of the things that we'll see is a distinctive character of both Jewish, in particular Jewish women, is this frank and open talk about sexuality, which to the present day becomes a defining feature of really the contributions of Jewish women in comedy, sort of putting things out there that one would not expect. So we can think about, do we draw a line from people like Sophie Tucker and Fanny Bryce, who is most famously played as Funny Girl by Barbara Streisand, to people like Sarah Silverman and Amy Schumer, right, to the present day, where we can see this frank and open discussion of sexuality by women. Milton Berle is another example of this, who plays an important role on television. The Three Stooges, who I will come back to, the Marx Brothers, who I've referenced before. All famous examples of Jews from this period of either immigration, they're children of immigrants, who play a very large role in sort of breaking in and introducing themselves to the American cultural scene through the use of humor. Now, I don't know how many people, and we can discuss this in the Q&A, have seen Duck Soup. One of my favorite films, a fantastic sort of parody of government, the misfunction of government, fascism, who is qualified to be a leader, who is not qualified to be a leader, an upstart who finds his role into being a leader. In this case, Groucho, you can see here the cover from Duck Soup, plays the part of Rufus T. Firefly, someone who is completely unqualified to be a leader. Yet this is comedy, not real life, right? So I'll put that aside for a moment. But it is a satire at the same time through a film of government, of politics of the time. But I asked my students, and when we watch it, we discuss this, what's Jewish about a film like Duck Soup, right? There are no references in the film to Jewishness. There are stereotypes and features of Jewishness that are represented in the film. Is it Jewish humor if it's just a Jewish performer or Jewish writer, or does the content itself have to be Jewish? And we're going to see this play out throughout the course of what we're going to talk about through the rest of class today, this sort of dilemma. Because Duck Soup is a perfect example of this. You have the Marx Brothers, the four Marx Brothers represented in this film. Groucho, Harpo, Chico, and Zeppo are all in the film. Of course, they're all Jewish. There's no Jewish content to the film itself. They imagine this sort of imaginary land of Fredonia. Rufus T. Firefly, who is not equipped to be the leader of this land. But at the same time, there is an entire subtext of the film itself that is very Jewish, right? He takes offense to anyone who refers to him as an upstart, as someone who does not belong there, who finds offense in the idea that people think that he has no business entering into leadership, entering into politics. There is a huge class divide that is engaged with, where under the surface you can see immigrants who feel offended by the aristocracy and trying to break in. And yet, one of the repeated themes that we will see is a theme that Groucho Marx plays with throughout his entire career. And we can almost see this as a metaphor for Jewish engagement with American society, any culture within which they live, which is this idea, And Woody Allen quotes this in Annie Hall after he is supposedly accepted into the Front Club. Please accept my resignation. I don't want to belong to any club that will accept people like me as a member, right? And of course, Woody Allen famously uses this line in Annie, where he says, this is basically summarizes all of my relationship with women, that I would never want to belong to a club that would have me as a member. But we can see this as a metaphor for engaging with the question of Jews trying to assimilate into the culture and argue that they want to belong. But as soon as they have success, then there's this self-deprecating notion of what does that say about this culture if they would accept somebody like me as a member? And so this tension is always played up in Jewish humor in particular, with sort of trying to engage with the tension between acceptance and being locked out of the culture. Next week, I'm going to talk about sort of how we can see this represented in sort of responses to Nazism. So I'll skip over the Three Stooges for now. But I want to think about then, what are the sort of archetypes of how Jews come to represent themselves before American culture, in a way where they use comedy and humor in a way to say, we are immigrants, you should accept us, we are not dangerous, but they also want to maintain their distinctiveness. So we can see Groucho Marx is a perfect example of this. Groucho Marx, throughout Duck Soup, uses his intellect, uses his wit to outsmart everyone around him, right? There is this dynamic where he's constantly sort of talking circles around everyone. He is kind of the archetype of the intellectual, neurotic, smaller Jewish male who does not have the physical strength, does not have the prestige, does not have the tools of the aristocracy to sort of promote himself. All that he has is his wit, his intellect, and his very neurotic sense, low sense of self, which we can see repeated throughout, right? We can draw a line from sort of the stereotypical Jewish male that is represented by somebody like Groucho Marx, to Woody Allen, to Jerry Seinfeld, to Larry David, to George Costanza. I mean, you can go down the line and you will see that there is a very specific type of Jewish male that has been represented to the American public since the time of Groucho, at least, which then should lead us to the question of, well, what is the image of the Jewish female? What is the image of the Jewish woman that is represented through comedy? And on the one hand, you have somebody like Gertrude Berg, in the case of the Goldbergs. I know that, Marcia, we had talked about showing the You Who Mrs. Goldberg as an example of a wonderful documentary film where you see Gertrude Berg. If you've seen interviews with her, you can see it in this documentary. She does not sound like Molly Goldberg. She does not sound like a new immigrant who is trying to raise her family in the Bronx and has a very thick accent. And yet she puts on this show that is a comedy, and you can watch whole episodes of it on YouTube if you like, that examines this tension between the newbie, the new immigrant in society, the Jewish mother who is very concerned about keeping her whole family together, and the children who are Americanizing, right? This central tension, this generational tension of the sitcom, and it is used for humorous purposes. It is a very Jewish show, right? And it's put on American television from the late 40s into the mid 50s. There are whole episodes that deal very exclusively with dreams. There's a Yom Kippur episode, which you can watch on YouTube if you Google it, where they go to services and they're, singing Kol Nidre. I mean, it's really, really Jewish. We don't see anything this Jewish on television until today, right? If we watch Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, right, you can start these really Jewish themes on television again. But she is the stereotype of the kind of overbearing Jewish mother who was very involved in her children's lives, worries about them. This is a stereotype of the Jewish mother that will continue on American television for generations. And at the same time, we see Jewish women pushing back against that stereotype. So Belle Barth is a perfect example of this. It is off-color, raunchy. If I embarrass you, tell your friends. Again, another example of sort of a record that you can find on YouTube and listen to. Or Mike Nichols and Elaine May, which I won't play now for the interest of time, but you can also look up this sketch on YouTube, in which Elaine May plays the Jewish mother, and Mike Nichols plays the emasculated Jewish son over the course of this brilliant sketch, reverts to, is infantilized and reverts to his childlike nature. So, as I've said, we can trace these two archetypes of the representations of Jews in American popular culture from, on the one hand, the nebbishy, neurotic Jewish man, the self-deprecating humor that it becomes very much associated with Jewish comedians, who is quick-witted. Sometimes bad things happen to him, gets no respect. We'll talk about Rodney Dangerfield. Versus on the other side, the overbearing Jewish mother, the Jewish American princess, which we'll talk about. And then the sort of counterpoint to that, the sort of raunchy, frank discussion of sex by some women to push up against those stereotypes. Okay, so about halfway through now, by the way. So, and I'm going to start playing some material for you, so you don't have to listen to me talking all the time. So Woody Allen, Alan Stewart Konigsberg, is one of the perfect examples of this sort of nebbishy, neurotic Jewish male stereotype. And I want to play for you, this is an example of early stand-up comedy done by Woody Allen as a way of sort of demonstrating how this works and how a Jewish comedian who is a child of the immigrant generation might try to use this stereotype to engage with the broader American public. So let's hope that this works.
I shot a moose once. I didn't mean to break it to you that way. I shot a moose. Was hunting upstate New York in the woods. I tied the moose onto the fender of my car, and I drove back home. But I didn't realize that the bullet had not penetrated the moose, but had just creased its scalp, knocking it unconscious. I'm driving home along the highway, and I'm going through a tunnel, and the moose woke up. So I'm driving with a live moose on my fender. And the moose is signaling for a turn. And there's a law in New York State against driving with a conscious moose Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. All right, I don't know what to do. I'm panicky. I realize some friends of mine are having a costume party. I'll go with the moose. I'll ditch him at the party. It wouldn't be my responsibility. So I drive to the party. I go up to the front door. The moose is next to me. I knock on the front door. The host comes to the door. I say, hello. You know the Solomons. We go in. The moose starts to mingle. Goes to the buffet table. Some guy tries to sell him insurance. The moose is doing great, meanwhile, you know. He scored. 12 o'clock comes. They judge who's got the best costume of the night. First prize goes to the Berkowitzes. A married couple dressed in a moose suit. The moose comes in second. moose is furious. He and the Berkowitzes lock antlers in the living room. They knock each other unconscious. Now I figure I'll get rid of them for good. I pile them on the fender and speed up to the woods. But I got the Berkowitzes. I'm driving along with two Jewish people on my fender. And there's a law in New York State. The next morning, the Berkowitzes wake up in the woods in a moose suit. Mr. Berkowitz is shot, stuffed, and mounted at the New York City Golf Club. And the joke is on them because they don't allow Jews.
Okay. So on the one hand, we have here sort of a classic Woody Allen, and I want you to sort of remember this image of Woody Allen as kind of the nebbishy, neurotic Jewish male. But there's also something else. There's a couple other things going on here with his jokes, which we'll come back to. One is the idea of sort of mistaken identity, right? And this is an important theme that we had last week when we looked at Shalom Aleichem and On Account of a Hat, which is, how do you perceive who is a Jew? Can you judge Jewishness based on appearance? And does that mistaken appearance have anything to do with acceptance or not acceptance in society? So the ultimate punchline of this joke is the New York Sports Club and the joke's on them because they don't allow Jews, right? And it's a very long joke about a moose and a moose suit, and what's the difference between an actual moose and somebody who dresses up in a moose suit, right? So I don't even know if Woody Allen is consciously thinking about this, but there's a much deeper subtext about appearances and what is essential and authentic in one's Jewishness. And would you want to belong to a club that would accept you based on appearance, right? Think about that, and we're going to come back to that theme, which we see repeating in a lot of cases, both in Shalom Aleicham's reflection and On Account of a Hat, and here in this joke. Oops. Okay. But we'll come back to Woody Allen. I'll say, and Woody Allen is an example of this. There are other comedians that are even more prominent examples of this, that we have these Jewish comedy writers who really, and there's a documentary film called When Comedy Went to School, which examines this idea. You have these Jewish writers, Jewish performers who really hone their chops in the Catskills, on the what's called the Borscht Belt, because you have Jews going up there for vacation over the course of the summer, a couple weeks in the summer, and they want to be entertained. So here you can see Jerry Lew is sort of reflecting on this idea of how he would have to, sort of use both physical comedy and sometimes this is before he becomes doing stand-up routines or performance-based comedy, just to entertain people. And that whole thing of people expecting to be entertained becomes very, very important. But one of the things that is distinctive about these Borscht Belt routines and these Jewish comedians who, sort of perform for what can sometimes be very difficult audiences in the Catskills, is that by and large, you have Jewish comedians performing for Jewish audiences, and they speak the same language, right? So they can tell Jewish jokes, they can engage in Jewish humor. It is still very much an insider humor. It is the humor of a people that are making jokes for people who can understand and can relate to the circumstances that they're dealing with. By the way, these are pictures that show sort of Grossinger's, for some of you will be familiar with, in Liberty, New York, from its heyday, and what it looks like after years of dilapidation. And there are all these wonderful places that people here in Connecticut will know that were these amazing resorts that fell into disuse. In some cases, there are efforts to resurrect them. This is a partial list of Jewish comedians who really kind of got their start in the Borscht Belt, in the Catskills. And you'll see it's really a who's who of Jewish comedy, so that by the 50s, 60s, you have these people playing a disproportionately large role in the American comedy scene, where you can have someone like Steve Allen, who I believe is the source for the number that by the late 1970s, something like 75% of all the comedians at work in America at that time, he said, were Jewish, right? So it's a disproportionately large number if we think about Jews representing just under, at the time, probably somewhere between 2 and 3% of the population. 75% of those represented in comedy, right? And a lot of them really get their start on the Borscht Belt. What's interesting about this is that, so this is, you know, as they say, when comedy went to school, this is sort of the training ground for these comedians. Post-World War II, what we start to see is these new entertainment forms, television in particular, that is going to rely on people who either have routines that are ready to go and be put on television. So Sid Caesar's Your Show of Shows is a perfect example of this, where you have people who have been writing for comedians, performers, either doing it in the Catskills or doing it in New York. You can see some of the writers on Your Show of Shows: Woody Allen, Mel Brooks, Selma Diamond, Larry Gelbart, Carl Reiner, Neil Simon. I mean, a who's who of some of the great Jewish humorists of the middle of the 20th century doing writing for the show. I'm going to play a little clip, not the whole thing, but a little clip from a famous sketch on Your Show of Shows. This is Sid Caesar as the German general.
Ach du lieber! 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 Ja, mein Herr.
Wat kan uit de kleine wat er uitstist, grijpen we uit de kleine wat er uit in Splett wat er aan.
Ja, mein General, ja, ja.
Das gefielte Rauch ist hier, was dann ist das Splendor hier?
Ja.
Das macht die, was tut aus ihr, das Mannegel ist geschmutzig. Geschmutzig! Ja!
Das Mannegel ist geschmutzig.
Das Mannegel ist geschmutzig und was macht die aus die kleine, du bist da, das da, das Gräsen ist verschmutzig ist.
Ja, ich hat geweitet.
Ja?
Ja.
Jetzt gefällt es ihr, macht ihr mal, mach Mannegel Spick und Spähen.
Ja, so.
Okay. It's easy to find if you look up the German general. We may have shared it before. Wonderful sketch, but one of the things that Sid Caesar is doing here, right? He grows up in Yonkers, but he grows up in a sort of polyglot universe where he works at his parents' diner in Yonkers, where he obviously hears a lot of Yiddish and is fluent in Yiddish. In this sketch, he uses something that he pioneers at the time, which is double talk, right? He is an expert at making it sound like he is speaking a foreign language, even when he's not speaking the foreign language. But what's fascinating about this is that this is being done for a broader American audience, right? This is translating sort of Jewish humorous sensibilities in such a way that it will translate to an audience of the 97% of Americans who are not Jewish through the main entertainment medium. And he is pretending to speak German. He's not speaking German. There's a couple of Yiddish words sprinkled in here, but he's using this double speak to make it sound like he's speaking German in a way that the audience will understand what he's saying. And it's really funny, right? So you got to watch the whole sketch. You'll see there is a punchline embedded at the very end that is also, maybe we'll talk about it next week, it's a punchline that is also anti-German, which makes sense in the aftermath of World War II, right? But it's embedded in a way that's translated for a much broader American audience. I'll just keep going in the interest of time. Of course, right, sort of perfect example of this is Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks in The 2,000-Year-Old Man, where the sort of the voice of the 2,000-year-old man played by Mel Brooks is this old Jewish guy from New York, right? And this accent of the old Jewish guy from New York becomes one of these recognizable archetypes of American comedy, right? So, you know, when Mel Brooks plays Moses walking down from Mount Sinai in the Ten Commandments, you know, in the history of the world, again, it is this old Jewish man voice, which he in many ways pioneers. Carl Reiner is the straight man. Mel Brooks plays the sort of old Jewish immigrant, and it sounds funny, and American audiences love it as well. This is, I'm going to skip it for now. This is non-threatening Jewish humor. I introduced that though because one of the important things that happens is you get somebody like Lenny Bruce, who is a real pioneer, really cutting edge, who begins to push back against this, push back against these stereotypes of how Jews are represented, push back against kind of the Jewish establishment, and push back against the establishment in large, right? Critiques religion in every sense, and also begins to ask the question of like, if this is how I talk backstage and I can curse and I can talk about sex backstage, why can't I do it on stage, right? I'm including for you here an excerpt of one of his sort of more well-known reflections on Jewishness. It's called Jewish and Goyish. I'm going to play this for you so you can hear him talking about what's Jewish and what's Goyish, because he begins to tap into what is really a truism of American comedy, American Jewish comedy at the time. We're going to hear Lenny Bruce here.
So it has to be very austere. I have a whole thing about, let me explain Jewish and Goyish to you. Okay, first the literate. Goy. One who is not of the Jewish faith. Second accepted, uncivilized. Goy, I think this is beautiful, is used by two groups. The Mormons, because that's all the definition. One who is not a Mormon is a Goy. Or, yes, beautiful. Okay, a Jew, which you may not be hip to, one who is regarded from descending from the ancient tribes of Judea. So Jewish and Goyish, but I have a different Goyish. I'll show you how it works. Eddie Cantor's Goyish. Gene Ammons is Jewish. Ray Charles is very Jewish. Al Jolson, Goyish. The Army is Goyish. The Navy is Goyish. The Marine Corps is Goyish. The Air Force is Jewish. Camel cigarettes, very Goyish. Salem's Jewish. Kent's Goyish. Viceroy's Marlboro is Jewish. Kool-Aid, Goyish. Very good. Instant potatoes, scary Goyish.
All right, I'm going to stop it there, right? White bread is Goyish, pumpernickel is Jewish. What he's doing here is beginning to point out sort of a distinction between what is Jewish and what is Goyish that has nothing to do with religion, right? This is this trajectory of becoming American and holding on to Jewishness, but he's articulating in a way that's not religious at all. It has to do with being authentic to your true self, which is why he can say somebody like Eddie Cantor is Goyish, Al Jolson is Goyish, Ray Charles is Jewish. And he starts to articulate this idea of being authentic, but he's also doing something very important, which is it is playing the part of the comedian who is also the political commentator, the philosopher, the one who speaks truth to power. And we're going to see this is very cutting edge at the time. It's not just about entertainment. It's about using comedy as a form of sort of social commentary. The prophets of our days are the comedians, right? And Lenny Bruce is one of the first to introduce this. Okay, I'm going to skip this. Of course, some of the most prominent comedians of that era are continuing what we've talked about, which is the self-deprecating Jewish humor of the time. Rodney Dangerfield, Jacob Cohen is a perfect example of this. It's all self-deprecating humor. It's all jokes about my wife, jokes about myself, right? And this stereotype continues. But you also see people who are very much influenced by Lenny Bruce. Joan Rivers is a perfect example of this, who says, right, watching Lenny Bruce kind of gave her the room. She says he was an epiphany, right? Lenny told the truth. And Lenny, and he talked about it. He would use the Yiddish word for emes, right? To tell the truth. He told the truth. And for her, it was this idea of maybe I can just go out on stage and say exactly what I'm thinking. I don't have to play a part. I don't have to play to a stereotype. I can say exactly what I'm thinking, right? It's outrageous, but she says it's cleansing and healthy, right? This is giving the psychological release to humor that some need. We'll talk about the producers of Mel Brooks next week. I just want to point out a couple of other things that become very important features of contemporary American comedy, bringing us up to the present. One is, Portnoy's Complaint, which many of you will be familiar with from Philip Roth, because I don't want to just talk about comedians. You know, Philip Roth is one of the most important, obviously, writers of the 20th century, but also humorous writers of the 20th century. But he does something very important in articulating what it means to be Jewish and trying to become American for him. And the difference between what is Jewish and what is Goyish, right? So he says that the non-Jewish children are the children that they mean on the signs we pass in Union, New Jersey, that say children at play, drive carefully, we love our children, right? These suburban Jews are not the Jewish children that he's familiar with in Newark, right? They don't have those kinds of signs in Newark. But if you skip down, he says these blonde-haired Christians are legitimate residents and owners of this place, and they can pump any song they want into the streets and no one is going to stop them. Oh, America, America. It may have been gold in the streets to my parents. It may have been a chicken in every pot to my mother and father. But for me, a child whose earliest movie memories are of Anne Rutherford and Alice Faye, America is a shiksa nestling under your arm, whispering, love, 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 love. Now, I point this out because, you know, we see this in Portnoy's Complaint. We're going to see this as well in Annie Hall, right? Timing is everything. 1970s, we see rising rates of intermarriage among American Jews. By the mid-70s, it's 25%. By the 80s, it's in the 40%. By the turn of the century, it's up to 50%, right? So timing is everything. But this idea of does becoming American is part of that also, this sort of idea of marrying somebody who's not Jewish or lusting after that person who is not Jewish. You can see it in Annie Hall and his relationship between Alvy and Annie, and of course that famous scene, right? So this screenshot in that famous scene, this is a millisecond in the movie, you know, I don't have time to play it now, but this is, if you Google Annie Hall Easter dinner, you will recall this scene where for Alvy Singer, this is the sort of crucial distinction between what his family looks like and what Annie's family looks like, right? It's a dynamite ham that they make, and they talk about, you know, boats and swap meets. And his family, we split the screen, and his family, they're talking about who got sick and who's dying, and they're yelling over each other, and it's completely different. But it's also, the movie is very much about his failed attempts to woo Annie Hall, to end up with somebody like Annie Hall. And as he says, to harken back to Groucho Marx, his relationships with women are always going to be about this idea that I would never want to belong to any club that would have me as a member. This motif of the relationship between Jewish men in particular and the sort of shiksa, the non-Jewish archetype of the blonde American woman, is a recurring theme that we see up to the present day. It's everywhere, right, in terms of defining relationships between the Jewish men and, whoops, okay, sorry, I'm skipping ahead, Jewish men and non-Jewish women. The last thing that I want to talk about before I wrap up, because I do want to leave some time for Q&A, is contemporary representations on television. Annie Hall, very important, 1977. But the truth is that when Woody Allen makes Annie Hall in 1977, there are, and what I'm showing you on this chart, it comes from a book by Vincent Brooke called Something Ain't Kosher. and it's about representations of Jews on American television. And he shows that between the 1950s, when the Goldbergs went off the air, and the 1970s, you can basically count in the 1960s, no shows, zero, that have Jews on television or representations of Jews on television. About 5 shows in the 1970s. And then towards the end of the 1980s, you start to see Jews appearing on American television again, right? And you'll remember the sort of famous debate that Seinfeld began, like, is this a Jewish show or not? You have these 4 characters who feel Jewish, but only Jerry, the title character, is the only Jewish character. The other ones are stereotypically Jewish, but as Jerry Stiller, who plays George Costanza's father on the show, as Jerry Stiller, Alava Shalom, he just passed away, as he said, you know, we were Italians, but we were really Jews living in Queens in the witness protection program. That show, you know, they are Jews, and George is the neurotic Nebuchadnezzar Jew, but they can't say it on the show. Another perfect example, if you remember the Golden Girls, right? B. Arthur and Estelle Getty, they're so Jewish on this show, except they're Italian, right? And on television, what they would very often do is have Italians in the 1980s be the sort of non-threatening, stereotypical other, even if it was Jews, okay? But it's not until the present day that we start to see a lot of these representations of Jews on television. In the 90s, we get things like Adam Sandler's Hanukkah song, where if you think about and you analyze that song, this is not a song about Jewish religious practice. This is a song about, I'm going to tell you about all these people who didn't know are Jewish based on their names, but they really are. And so you can feel proud of their Jewishness, right? And think about like Dauber's category about the ambiguous nature of Jewish identity itself as represented in a song like the Hanukkah song by Adam Sandler. I wish I had more time. We could talk about Seinfeld, the anti-dentite. There's very few episodes. If you read Tanny's The Jewishness of Seinfeld, you'll see he counts very few episodes that deal with specifically Jewish themes. This Yada Yada episode is an amazing example of this, because in this episode, I'll just play, I hope this starts in the right part.
What's up?
I'll tell you what's up. I'm a Jew.
Excuse me?
I'm a Jew. I finished converting 2 days ago.
Oh, well. Welcome aboard.
Thanks. So I'll see you tomorrow?
Yeah, I have a cavity lower left. Hey, were you just at the health club?
Oh, yeah.
No, we must have just missed you.
Ah, well, I didn't do much. I just sat in the sauna. You know, it was more like a Jewish workout. That's it.
Okay, in this, if you haven't seen this episode in a while, you can go back and watch it. It's asking this very serious question, not only about conversion, but about Jewish humor, right? And who gets to tell Jewish jokes? And do you have to be born Jewish to tell Jewish jokes? And Jerry gets offended by the fact that Tim Whatley, played by Bryan Cranston, aka Walter White for My New Mexicans, right? Does he get to convert to Judaism just for the jokes? And Jerry at the end gets accused of being a rabid anti-dentite, right? Because he's got sort of an anti-dentist streak to him, apparently. All right, so I'll just skip ahead and say that what's interesting between Seinfeld in the 90s and Curb Your Enthusiasm today is we can see the degree to which Larry, creator of Seinfeld, is unburdened by the strictures of NBC, which is corporate and dependent on advertising dollars and sponsors. And so it's a very sort of covertly, double-codedly Jewish show for a broad American audience, whereas Curb Your Enthusiasm can be overtly Jewish in so many ways, and he doesn't have to worry about it because either you pay for your HBO subscription or you don't. He's not worried about what advertisers are going to think. And in Curb Your Enthusiasm, we see Larry playing this archetype of the stereotypical neurotic Jew who is some of the humor is self-deprecating, some of the humor is neurotic, some of the humor is anti-Christian, jokes where Larry gets to make fun of Christianity because he can. Some of it is a response to anti-Semitism. A lot of incongruity between Larry as the Jew and Cheryl as his non-Jewish shiksa wife, and the humor that emerges from that tension. Larry as the social assassin who says whatever comes to his mind, and of course, humor that is based in the ambiguous nature of Jewish identity. Ben Stiller does the same thing, right? In many of his movies, it's a representation of the Jewish male who is lusting after the non-Jewish female. Basically, every Judd Apatow movie, Seth Rogen plays the same part, right? And that incongruity that emerges between those relationships. I always ask my students to write papers based on topics that they find interesting at the end of the semester. And I had 3 students this semester at UConn introduce me to Dave Bird, who I was not familiar with, who is a wannabe Jewish rapper who now has a new show on FX and plays upon Jewish stereotypes to great effect. You can see his name, his rapper name, Lil Dicky. I'll leave it to your imagination to figure out what he's referring to here. These are sort of like what the kids are watching today, right? And what's striking to me is that some of those same Jewish stereotypes that we began with continue up to the present day. I'll end with, and I didn't have time to talk about Sarah Silverman and representations of women, and some of you have watched Mrs. Maisel, but one of the interesting things, and this is where I'll end with, is so you have one of the most Jewish shows on television, right? Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, it's on Amazon Prime, it follows a Jewish family, and she wants to be a stand-up comedian, and Lenny Bruce is in it. But you have Midge, played by Rachel Brosnahan, right? Who's not Jewish. And so it raises this question, just like we asked with John Mulaney as another example, right? If you're married to somebody Jewish, or if you play a Jew on TV, does that make it Jewish humor? Who gets to tell the jokes? Have we gotten to a point where 100 years ago, we knew who the Jewish immigrants were who emerged from a Jewish environment and a Jewish milieu? Or has Jewish humor become so synonymous with American humor that almost anyone can play the part, right? It's not a function of sort of the integration into American society. Jews have become so successful at making American humor Jewish or Jewish humor American that almost anyone now can be a quote unquote Jewish humorist, whether they're born Jewish or not. I'm going to leave it there, and I'm happy to answer questions that have come in through the Q&A. All right, so if they're, I don't know if they're, are they coming in through the Q&A or are they coming in through the chat?
People are having trouble with the screen, so part of it is that.
Okay, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to unshare my screen so that people can type into the chat. And I know that some people are raising their hands, but I think we don't have a way to unmute people. So if you're raising your hand, please type your question either into the chat or into the Q&A, and I'll be able to see it there and respond to it there.
Okay. So, Avi, let me ask this one question. How is this going to transfer into next week's program while we're getting the chats? Okay.
Sure. So next week, and I start to see questions coming in now, but I'll just say as a preview, if before people are signing off, for next week, I'm going to talk very specifically on this question of how Jewish humor responds to anti-Semitism, and also the issue of Holocaust humor. and what are the boundaries of humor about the Holocaust? How do Jews use humor as a coping strategy to respond to anti-Semitism, and both before, during, and after the Holocaust? And then how does this translate to the question of what's appropriate or inappropriate in terms of humor vis-a-vis the Holocaust? You can think about we're 20 years post Life is Beautiful, and sort of the controversy that a film like that aroused. And so one of the things we'll look at is, again, this question of who gets to tell the jokes. Is it only Jews who get to use humor as a coping mechanism to deal with the Holocaust, or can someone like Roberto Benigni do it? And how has that changed over time? So I see a couple of questions that have come in. Let's see. Okay, so this was Susan Cooper asked about Sephardi Jewish humor. Oh, okay, and I'm seeing both chat and sorry, I'm seeing both chat and Q&A, so I'll try to answer both. So Susan Cooper asked about Ashkenazi-based humor, and the truth is this came up last week as well, this question about Sephardic Jewish humor. And I have to say that my mother, Nurit, who might still be on here, was helpful in kind of looking up different examples of, we were having a discussion over the course of this week, so about different types of Sephardic Jewish humor. So, going back to the Middle Ages, you have examples like Avram Ibn Ezra, philosophical, intellectual types of what we would call Sephardic Jewish humor, the experiences of Jews living in Muslim lands. What I want to do is, we see this less represented in the American context, but what I'd like to do is, when I get to my class about Israel, where we're going to talk about Jewish immigration to Israel, I want to come back to how we see representations of Sephardic Jewish humor and the humor of Jews from Arab lands represented in Israeli humor. So in 2 weeks, I'm going to come back to that question. Yeah, so this issue of Americanizing names is a really interesting question, and I think I'm trying to remember. There's a great book that I'm blanking on right now that deals with this issue of name changing in the American context. Sort of towards the end of the 20th century, you start to see this diminishing, in particular by performers to a great extent. And I think one of the things that's interesting about this, and we can reflect on what this means, is that, so Vincent Brooke, who I alluded to, and I skipped over his slide, he makes this argument that representations of Jews on television kind of solve two problems for Jews in American society. On the one hand, they wanted to assimilate. On the other hand, they wanted to maintain sort of this Jewish distinctiveness, right? This tension between holding onto their Jewishness but becoming American. And what we can trace over the end of the 20th and beginning of the 21st century is that as Jews have become less religious, secularizing, what's interesting is this sort of cultural representation of Jewishness that might be represented through humor or comedy is a way to hold on to a distinctive Jewish identity that doesn't have to be a religious identity. And this is something I'm actually writing a paper on now, because I think it's a very interesting, might answer the question of humor is much more important to American Jews and their identity than it is to Israelis. And it might be a solution to the problem of how do you maintain a secular, non-religious Jewish identity that's distinctive, but doesn't make you completely assimilated. And I think this can be reflected in sort of the answers of people who change their names or not. So yes, Jewish humor in Europe. I'll mention, and this is interesting, and I'll talk about this next week as well. In the book, Laughter After, we look at, so it's an edited volume that compares how comedians, sketch comedies deal with the issue of the Holocaust. And one of the chapters, which I'll talk about next week, looks at a comedian in Germany who, it's a very different context to be a stand-up comedian who's obviously Jewish in Germany, talking about the Holocaust, and he uses it very specifically as a tool of memory and a political tool to say, like, I'm not going to let you guys forget about this, but it's part of his routine. So you could see this played out in different contexts. Yes, there's a point here I'll just say about, I think it's an excellent point about producers and business owners who put on these acts. So I think this is a very important point. I focus just on the writers and the performers, but of course there's a market for it. And the truth is, and this gets into some of the complexities of sort of the market for Jewish comedy, even in the 1950s and the 1960s, we can see Jews who are in television or Jews who are in Hollywood who put negative pressure on Jewishness or representations of Jewishness on film or on the small screen, the big screen, the small screen, because they're concerned about things being too Jewish. Seinfeld is a perfect example of this, right? You have Jews in positions of power at NBC making programming decisions, telling Larry and Jerry that the show's too Jewish, because they're worried that they don't want to have a show that is too overtly Jewish that will alienate the 98% of the American public that's not Jewish. And so they can recognize what's too Jewish. And so what this leads to are shows like Seinfeld in the 90s or Friends. Friends, if you go back and you look at the shows, you have, Ross and Monica Geller, who are Jewish, but actually Rachel Green is also Jewish in the show, but they're not overtly Jewish. You have to go back and read it as a coded type of Jewishness. The writers are Jewish, the producers of the show are Jewish, the executives at NBC are Jewish, but it's coded in such a way that the audience, those who are Jewish will understand that it's Jewish. Those who are not Jewish will not see that, but they'll see the humor in it, and that's the double coding. There's a question here about Sacha Baron Cohen, which I think is a really good question. And I wish I had more time to talk about Sacha Baron Cohen. I think he's a fascinating example of somebody who, on the one hand, uses the mockumentary style. Maybe we'll, I will talk about Sacha Baron Cohen next week when we talk about responses to anti-Semitism, because this is a great example of double coding. If you think about Borat, where you have like a sort of anti-Semitic journalist from Kazakhstan who's exposing anti-Semitism and racism and homophobia in American society, but he's doing it in Hebrew, except most of the American audience is not going to understand that he's speaking Hebrew when he's speaking to his friend Azamat, but it's double coding. Only Jews would understand that he's speaking speaking Hebrew. New York humor that is Jewish, there might almost be sort of a, by the time of Woody Allen, there is this Northeastern New York coded humor that's synonymous with Jewish humor. Okay. I think maybe I'll do one more question and then we'll call it a day. All right, so duck soup. Okay, I'm gonna end with this question about duck soup, which I think is from Jeremy Schwartz. Hi, Jeremy. One is about going back to duck soup. Do you see its anti-nationalism as Jewish? And two, who would you see as a male comedian pushing back against the stereotypes after Lenny Bruce? Okay, really. So first about duck soup. Yeah, I think the political commentary that's in there about, let's think about this movie comes out basically in 1930. It's a critique of sort of ultra-nationalist movements and the rise of fascism, which would be happening with Mussolini in Italy at the time. It's a post-World War I critique of sort of the hypocrisy of those who are in power. It's a really hard question, Jeremy, as to whether it's Jewish or not. And I think it's up for debate. I think what you can see is the critique of the outsiders like Groucho. That's definitely Jewish. Are the politics in it Jewish or not? I think that's up for debate. I don't know if I can say clearly. Definitely Groucho being the outsider and calling himself an upstart, and or rejecting the notion of being an upstart is quite Jewish. And then your last question, who would you see as a male comedian pushing back against the stereotypes after Lenny Bruce? Yeah, Lenny Bruce is sort of such a, and in fact, in Laughter After, there's a chapter in here by my friend Jenny Kaplan, and the title of the chapter, Jenny writes, is called Nebish's New Jews and Humor, the Changing Image of American Jewish Masculinity Post-Holocaust. And she argues that Woody Allen is the Nebish stereotype, but she said that Lenny Bruce is sort of underappreciated from a gendered standpoint as being kind of this masculine, macho character on stage who is very much pushing back against these stereotypes. And she argues that it has a lot to do with, the way in which he is received and in which society is not prepared for him. And I think this is part of his critique, that sort of Jews who are playing Nebushi neurotic Jews that are seen as unthreatening, he sees this as, we could call this, instead of blackface, we can call this like playing in Jew face. And he, I think, is critiquing that people are not being authentically themselves, right? They're not being true to themselves. Most of the people, the representations of Jews that we see on television in the comedy world, I think are continuations of this sort of Nebushi neurotic stereotype. So that Larry David and Jerry Seinfeld and Woody Allen, they're all kind of very similar. This guy I just mentioned, Dave Bird, he's interesting. He might be pushing up against that representation in terms of how Jews represent themselves as a Jew who's trying to break into the rap game. Okay. Yeah, and I see a response here about, yeah, I agree with Thomas's point. Nationalist movements, the critique is that nationalism is, ultra-nationalism, ethnic nationalism is generally bad for Jews. 100% agree with that. In the sort of European context and the American context. And so in that sense, you could totally see that as being a response to that. All right, I think we're done for today. So I want to thank all of you for joining us here today. And I will look forward to seeing all of you next week as we discuss Jewish humor as a response to anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. Thank you.
Professor Patt, thank you very much. We'll see you next week.
See you next week. Thank you.